Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Marico, again for the kind introduction. And so I prepared for you a presentation of how to perform a systematic review and meta-analysis. It's going to be a step-by-step introduction. And you should have received the paper that has been, okay, so some of you may have read the paper. And we're gonna go from the slide to the paper to see how the things are done practically. Don't hesitate to stop me anytime to ask me questions. I prefer that this is a very interactive session than just me presenting. So don't hesitate. I won't hesitate to ask a question, by the way. I will start. What is a systematic review? Any thoughts about that?
I guess you pick a topic that you want to investigate, and you do a full-blown literature review on that, and then you, I guess, try to figure out what the literature is saying about that given topic.
Right. Yes. Any other thought?
And set some inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Inclusion and exclusion criteria. That's good. Good. Someone else?
You would also have to detail how you search and search phase and why now do you include or exclude that as well.
Very good, very good. So broadly we cover the definition of a systematic review. And for example, I just found this definition. It's a type of literature review that uses systematic methods, so you say systematic, to collect secondary data, critically appraise research studies, and synthesize findings qualitatively and quantitatively. So it's a little bit like you have a lot of papers published, a lot of literature, and you select some items from this literature, but that's not enough because you have to give an output that is intelligible. It's something that is go beyond just a collection of studies on one topic. You give to the reader an organization, an organized appraisal of the literature that you reviewed. And why should we perform a systematic review and meta-analysis? Any thoughts about that?
There's usually a lot of information on a given topic, and many people come at with different research questions and looking at a lot of different information from different samples. So the best way to get a good idea of what's happening with one particular topic is to analyze all the data together.
Right. That's very good. So there are a lot of literature out there. Papers are published every day. There are tons of papers. I think we should be able to read 40 papers a day to be up to date with the topic. That is, of course, impossible. And those systematic review enable to summarize those literature, so one can read just the literature review and have an idea of what's going on. Other ideas?
We see consistency and inconsistency in findings, and then determine an overall estimate of effect size.
Very good. So overall effect size over and beyond differences between studies. So to synthesize the knowledge on a given topic, this is already known. To inform decision making and policy, also we're going to see the systematic review and meta-analysis is very useful, for example, to make decisions to policymakers. To quantify an association over and beyond difference in single studies, as you said. There is a lot of studies that present, for example, contrasting findings or significant and non-significant findings. There are studies that comes from certain populations, certain region of the world. We want to be able maybe to have an overview of this, what is known in this topic over and beyond these differences. Also to examine heterogeneity, the reason why the studies that are conflicting, for example, are conflicting, why there are differences between studies. Maybe you already see this pyramid that describes the level of evidence in studies. Not all studies have the same strands of evidence. So case report of expert opinion, of course, are not very high in terms of strands of evidence. Evidence are stronger for studies that comes from observational studies like population-based study, core studies. Randomized control trials are even stronger because it's an experimental design. and you can explain, randomize people in one group and another. You know the design. But over randomized control trial, there are systematic review and meta-analysis that have even a stronger level of evidence, because you can, for example, analyze multiple randomized control trials together, multiple observational studies together, and decision maker use the information you publish in a systematic review and meta-analysis to, for example, decide on guidelines, whether you should treat this kind of patient with this kind of drugs, depending of the evidence available from multiple studies. And then you can translate this knowledge in an effective policy or tools for decision making. So it is really a powerful design to inform someone that have to make decisions. Also, there is another reason is to decide when the literature is enough, when we have enough evidence to for example, make a decision about an association. And I show you an example. This is what we call a cumulative meta-analysis, and basically it showed that the first study that has been done on, in this case, it was thrombolytic therapy on myocardial infarction. You cannot really make a decision based on one studies, and so there is no recommendation possible. I don't have any. You see my mouse? Okay. So on the basis of some studies, you cannot have any recommendation about whether it's a good drug or not for this disease. So each line is the summary of the precedent lines. So the previous line are summarized in this line. As you can see, the more the studies are accumulating, so the more patients are included and analyzed together, the more we go toward a conclusion of the efficacy of the treatment. And they never do a meta-analysis in these years, for example in 75, but if they did do a meta-analysis, they would have found that there were enough evidence for establish this type of therapy as a good treatment for myocardial infarction, and all these patients that has been included after this level of evidence was available, well, half of these patients has not received the good treatment, has received the placebo. So probably doing a systematic review in 1980 would be enough, for example, to establish the treatment as a good treatment for myocardial infarction. And so all those patients that follow would have not be randomized, and so half of them have received a placebo. Another question is why I keep on saying systematic review and meta-analysis instead of saying just meta-analysis.
I don't think you get an effect size estimate with a systematic review. I could be wrong. I don't know.
It's right. You cannot have an overall estimate with a systematic review. But the point I want to make is that there is different level of, let's say, different kind of review. Traditional narrative review, the one we, for example, perform for an introduction of a paper or from a thesis, they are narrative, non-systematic, and while when we perform a systematic review, is the idea we said before, is a systematic approach, reproducible approach. You establish inclusion criteria, you establish an objective, you establish everything before starting the studies. And this systematic feature is a big determinant of the level of evidence you are producing. Just some of these systematic reviews go on and perform a quantitative meta-analysis. This is just an optional component of a systematic review. You may know this figure is a forest plot. You may see in meta-analysis. This is the calculation of the overall effect size you talked about. And this is just available for some of the systematic review. And you have to decide whether your systematic review can do the further step to the go on and translate into a quantitative meta-analysis. There are some reasons why you can or cannot perform this meta-analysis, the quantitative meta-analysis. For example, you can add this step of meta-analysis if the same outcome overall measure between the study you collected. If you have the same exposure or treatment, so if I say exposure is an independent variables in experimental studies, maybe it's the language you are more familiar with. So being exposed to a certain disease, a certain condition, I just call it exposure. If the association are reported in similar way, for example, you're gonna see that there are different ways to report an estimation, and not always is possible to pull together those estimates. And also you have to judge in a qualitative way if the studies are meta-analyzable, if they are not different, too much different, that would prevent to perform this quantitative meta-analysis. So to sum up, systematic review and meta-analysis allows one to synthesize the knowledge and provide high level of evidence. This may inform knowledge translation and policy making. Also, they are based on an explicit method and procedure. It is a systematic part to identify, to select, to synthesize the results from different separate studies. And also meta-analysis is just a final part, an additional component of systematic review. Nothing changed between a systematic review and a systematic review with meta-analysis, except from the quantitative part. Okay, now we're gonna go through some steps that you may want to use to perform a meta-analysis. So I think that there are 9 basic steps, from preparing your research protocol to the performing the literature review, screening all the article, extracting all the information, assessing the quality of the information, perform a narrative review, all that, and then perform a meta-analysis and also some other analysis. And finally, reporting the studies. That is not a step you should forget. So preparing and registering the protocol. So the first step, so for people that like quote, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 sharpening my axe. For all studies and meta-analysis in particular, it's very important, good planning, to planify all the objectives, to planify the population, the analysis, and every step of the process. Questions that we may want to ask are, what is the objective of a systematic review and meta-analysis? We have to think about and write down what the objective is. What is the population? What is the population? What is the patients or non-patients that we are going to include in our analysis? What is the main exposure or the main independent variables, the main treatment? What is the main outcome? Are there multiple outcomes which we are interested? So what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, why you should select an article or not select an article? There is an acronym, PICO, or PECO, to remember the 4 main things to define at the beginning of the studies. So P is for population, E is for intervention, if you are summarizing, for example, randomized control trial when you have an intervention, or it can also be declined as exposure if you are interested into more observational and epidemiological information. C is for comparison, so you can compare the people that have an intervention to people that don't have this intervention, or they have a different intervention. And finally, the outcome. For example, let's take the paper you read, the systematic review that you read, that we performed. What is the objective of this systematic review? Yes.
Just to look at the perinatal and pregnancy factors that were related to suicide later on in life.
Right. So to estimate the association between early life factors and suicide attempts, and suicide ideation. What is the population? On which population we were focusing on? Were there patients? Were they, for example, patients with depression? Or were just, for example, the general population? we decided to perform these studies among the general population. We didn't select, for example, studies conducted among people with a particular, for example, diagnosis. So non-clinical studies. What is the main exposure or treatment? Well, we focus on exposure because our independent variable were being exposed to some factors versus not being exposed. So, for example, we selected very general all early life, defined as in utero or perinatal factors. We also defined that those factors had to be measured up to 1 year of age. And as for example, main outcomes, we decided to use suicide, suicide attempt, and suicidal ideation. We defined to exclude, for example, self-harm, where the intent of the self-harm was not specified in the study. So if you read, for example, the method section, you found all this information that I reported. And the last question was about the inclusion-exclusion criteria. For example, we wanted to include all the studies without, regardless, for example, the date of publication. You may want to restrict the studies, for example, to those published in the last 10 years or last 5 years. Or we did not set any age limits. Not geographical limit. You may want to just restrict your studies, for example, in Western country, non-Western country. We didn't specify any geographical limits. We did include all just the articles that were peer-reviewed and published. It means that we did not focus on unpublished papers. For example, a thesis, we didn't focus on these unpublished reports, and also those published in English to reduce the amount of studies, and also because this is a criteria of quality. We include just the study that meet the definition of the population and exposure and outcome as you saw before. So we did all that before starting the studies. Yes?
When I was reading, I actually had a question about when you decide whether you're going to limit the peer-reviewed articles or if you're going to look at gray literature as well.
Okay.
What would be the factors that would lend to that decision?
Well, basically the guidelines. So there are collaborations in the world, like the Cochrane collaboration that perform meta-analysis. Are collaborations that are around the world. Their objective is to perform meta-analysis and to respond to questions whether some treatment is effective or not. And they suggest to include all the literature, including gray literature. So you have to balance the advantages and inconveniences to do that. For example, you know that articles that are published and peer-reviewed, they met at least some standards of quality. And also, you may want to, for example, have access to the data, because you may want to contact the person and have access to the data. Sometimes this is difficult when, for example, you find a thesis, a master thesis, for example, that focus on that, you cannot contact the master students anymore, for example. And also is a way to restrict the amount of information, because in case there is too much information to focus on, this may be a criteria to use. So it's really up to the researcher evaluate how this decision can have an impact on the study. We thought it was not a big deal not to consider gray literature, because all these big studies, you need resources and are published in peer-reviewed journals 100%. Also, we put English, published in English as a definition criteria. This is the same. We may have missed studies published in, I don't know, Italian. But it's very rare that a study that needs so many resources to follow up people from years and to collect data from register are not published in an English review. So in terms of this acronym, P is individual from the general population, all the ages, both sexes. Having a given early life factors is the exposure, and not having is the comparator. And the three outcomes were suicide, suicide attempt, and suicidal ideation. So it's important to define all elements at the beginning of the studies, because it's now strongly suggested to register those information before starting the studies. There is a big issue of but you find results and then you change the objective of the studies. So it's better to pre-specify everything at the beginning of the study, and to register then all those decisions in a public available, let's say, database. And this is one of them. The most common is called Prospero. You can register for free, and you can also look for information for systematic review that are ongoing. You just look, for example, I look for my name here, and I found our studies that were registered here. And you can access the studies and see, for example, some of the decisions we take. You can see whether our population, what's the definition of our exclusion inclusion criteria. You can hide some information if maybe you don't want to, for example, make public your research, your algorithm of research, your search algorithm, because you want to keep for you until the study is published. You can do that. And also importantly, you can also check if there are other systematic review on the same topic that are ongoing. So you may not to do the same papers, they work at another one. Second step is performing the literature search. And the third question is which database we're going to use. If you go to the McGill library website, here on database search, you find a lot of databases. There are databases from every field of studies, every discipline. The most common and also the more interesting for our field, psychology, psychiatry, mental health, are of course Medline. You may know as PubMed. PubMed is just an interface that enables you to access Medline, but you can access differently. PsycInfo, Embase. PsycInfo is more for psychological science, and Embase is like PubMed but for European studies. Social Science Citation Index is you access to Web of Science, and you can find a lot of papers on the Social Science Index there. CINAHL is another database from nursing science, also very useful. A little before you have to make the decision whether you use gray literature or not. So if you include, for example, unpublished reports that you don't find in those databases. And you have to specify all that in the Prospero protocol. You ask the item to specify all those decisions. So I assume everybody has used PubMed, right? So you can just write here the words you want to look for, and you obtain the results of your search. You may also note that here there is a mesh database. This is a very useful tool. Why? Because you can enter in this PubMed search string, you can enter like free text term, like whatever word you want, but also use some terms from the thesaurus. The thesaurus is like a dictionary, a vocabulary that each of these database has. There is one thesaurus, one database, one dictionary for each database. And in PubMed, for example, it's called MESH, medical subject headings. If I look, for example, for depression, in this dictionary, you can find, for example, words that are related. You can be interested into depression analysis, depression blood. You can check some of these cases to decide which information you want to include. And also you can write how you can see how this information is organized. Depression, for example, is under behavioral symptoms. This is under behavior. This is under, psychiatry and psychology, and etc. So, for example, if you are interested in all psychiatric disorder or behavioral symptoms, you can just write behavioral symptoms in PubMed with the appropriate search term, and you can include all those symptoms without specifying all the words singularly. So this dictionary. So each article published in PubMed, if you go at the bottom of the paper, you see which words are related to which articles. And so when you publish an article, the article go to the PubMed people that put it into the database and organize these articles, and they attribute some labels, for example, this mesh term. And you can say, for example, this paper is being indexed with all those mesh terms. You can have ideas. on how to build your search algorithm on the basis of the mesh term used in other papers. And basically, to systematically search for papers, but you have to use combine those words using what's called Boolean operators. I also imagine that everybody has used this before. So basically, you want to broaden your research using the OR operators and narrow your research using the NOT and AND operators. For example, if you want to take all the articles that talk about depression or anxiety, you write depression or anxiety, and you pick articles that are at least in one of these two topics. If you want to papers that are on the topic of depression and anxiety together in the same paper, you want to use the AND operator. So you just pick the paper that concern the two topics together. And same things if you want to exclude, for example, find papers on depression that exclude topic of anxiety, use NOT. So it's very easy to use those operators, but it's very complicated to build an overall algorithm. Basically, we use the algorithm in this way. You want to use to combine different categories of words, and we, for example, use suicide or suicide attempt or self-harm and all other words that may indicate suicide behavior, suicide ideation, and all those terms are linked with an OR word. Then we also link together with OR all the words that can help us finding risk factors, and same things we link with the OR all words that are related to our design. For example, we use observational studies, so there are cohort, register, case control, etc. And all these three categories of words we bring together. We link together with an AND. So, for example, these search strategies can find every article that have at least one of the three words as a specific words, and one of these two words, and one of the three words in the logic. And it can be very complicated because there are a lot of words. And if you see the appendix of the paper in the first table, we report the whole research strategy. And importantly, this was made by yes, Despina.
How do you know when you're making these terms that you've exhausted all the possibilities?
Well, you don't know basically, but you have to use a lot of terms to ensure to be the most exhaustive possible. For example, one strategy would be use mesh terms, the terms we see before, because you're sure that someone else categorized paper in the same way. But this is not a perfect strategy because some papers are not categorized. So you use this free text term. For example, here I use suicide and then a little stars. These words is supposed to pick all words that have their root suicide in it. So suicidal, suicidality, suicide, etc. So this is a way to expand your research. The more you want to be exhaustive, the more your paper you have to treat after. So you have also to find a balance between being exhausted and also have a manageable amount of study. Importantly, you can also ask the help of a librarian, and again there are librarians that helps you to do this search. So they are professionals, they are trained on that, they are very expert. They use, for example, tools that you cannot have access to. And we did ask help of a librarian. This is a co-author in the paper, and she performed this amazing systematic search on PubMed and translate in two other datasets like PsycInfo and Embase. So we are very consistent on our search strategy. She made the search strategy being peer reviewed. So she asked colleagues to review her decision how to put terms in it, and so it's very exhaustive strategy. So you just go to the website, choosing your disciplines, and contact the librarian if you want to perform this. So let's say that we choose for database, list for database, and we found all those records, 2,000 for Medline, 3,000 for PsycInfo, etc. So we have a lot of records that we found from those databases. But of course, the same papers can be indexed in multiple of these databases. So you can find duplicates of the paper. First step is to eliminate those duplicates. So, for example, out of 8,000 records, you may find that 6,000 are unique records and 2,000 are on multiple data sets. You can eliminate those records. It's very important to use a reference manager software to do that, because eliminate 2,000 paper by hand may take a long time, and those reference manager software, they do that automatically. You can use EndNote. It is free for example, students from McGill. Zotero, this is free for everybody. I use Zotero personally. For this study, you use EndNote, I think, because the librarian used EndNote. They're all more or less equivalent, but it is very important to use those pieces of software that are very, very useful. Do you have any question about? Yes, please.
I have a question, because we're actually doing some systematic reviews in my lab right now, and one of the issues that I've encountered and somebody else has is that we've done our search, and then, for example, we'll just write our terms on Google Scholar, for example, and we'll end up finding some articles that we didn't really catch in our through the databases, or I'll even find just through scanning references of the papers that I do find, I'll find some articles that are more pertinent. So I'm just wondering, is that a fault in my own review, searching, or does that typically happen?
Well, that's interesting. Yes. So before starting the studies, I just did an exploratory search for the studies that, for example, may be interesting for me, and I end up finding 20 papers, for example. And I just read the paper, and that was just the beginning of the idea of this project. When we performed this systematic review, the first thing that I checked is my 20 papers that I found by myself were also found in the systematic search. This for me is an indicator of how good is the strategy. So the result was I found 19 of the 20 papers. So I consider it was a good search strategy, search algorithm. So maybe you want to go back to your search and see whether you can open those papers in PubMed, the papers that you didn't find in a search strategy, but that you did find yourself, and see which mesh terms with thesaurus terms are used to index those papers. Maybe you may find that some of these terms are missing from your strategies, and then you integrate. I would do that, but it happens.
Yeah, and just add as well something, you can add papers in a systematic review that were found through and search, for instance.
Okay, yeah.
So it's possible.
Right,
You can
yes.
the papers identified through your search in the database and through and search as well.
Exactly. Yes. I had something later about that. But yes, it's perfect. You can do that. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, we already have step 4, screening. Screening process. So the number of unique records you found, for example, we say 6,000 before, is not the actual number of papers you're going to use in your meta-analysis, your systematic review. So you have to screen all those papers against your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you find here it's very important to have strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. Otherwise, you can decide without those criteria. It's very difficult. And this is an example of what we report in the paper. So in the meta section, you can find, for example, studies were included if they were population-based studies or cohort studies. For example, we define each terms. If reporting an association between any in utero and perinatal factors, our exposure, and one of our outcomes, suicidal attempt, suicidal ideation, and also studies assessing self-harm, defining that no suicidal self-injury was excluded. So basically, the criteria we saw before. You have to specify those criteria. Have in mind those criteria when you're screening for your paper from the 6,000 that you have found. The screening process is you can see this process as a multiple level process. First, you just look at the title of the papers, and you can exclude most of the paper just because of the titles. You realize that, for example, you found a paper, cancer treatment is in older patients. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't fit my inclusion criteria, even without opening the paper. So by title, I can screen all the reference and exclude all those that are is very evident that is not related to my topic. The second level is by abstract, for example. Just clicking on just reading the abstract, we can realize if some inclusion criteria are respected or not, and include or not this paper according to what we see from the abstract. In this case, in case of doubt, you should just add the papers to your list of potentially included paper, and then see that in the last level of analysis means that you open all those, take the full text of all these potentially interesting articles, and you really make sure that in the paper all the inclusion criteria are respected. You just read carefully all the part of the paper. And one important thing is that this screening, at least from the abstract level, should be done independently by, for example, at least two researchers. I see Despina laughing here. We did this process together. We go on all the paper together to see if they independently, to see if they met the inclusion criteria or not. And when we had any doubt about whether the paper should be included or not, we asked, for example, Marie-Claude for her opinion. So a third opinion in case of doubt. You can calculate those agreements with simple statistics. And so this is, of course, if this agreement is high, it means that both people agree on the fact that one paper should be included or not. Otherwise, it's just by chance. And you may wonder how systematically is the review, or how well-defined were the criteria for including the paper. This is a useful piece of software, Rayan, that is free. Is a web page. Is a software that everyone can use. It's free, and it looks like this. You take all your records, for example, from EndNote of Zotero, and import in this software, and you can use the software. Multiple people can use the software independently. So, for example, if you say here, this is me, Massimiliano, and Despina, and independently this was masked. I could not see Despina's decision. Despina could not see my decisions. And we decided on this paper whether we should include or not the paper. So for example, we put a red tag whether the paper should be excluded, and a green tag whether the paper should be included. And then you can see, for example, here that you can see the level of agreement on for how many papers we agreed on including or excluding, or the paper we were conflicting. Yeah. And finally, you report the results of this search in the first figure of your paper. This is a flow chart, and basically you describe all the steps of your search and screening. For the literature search, how many duplicates we excluded, how many unique records remaining. Then the first step, the first level, excluding by titles. As you can see, most papers are excluded by titles. And then potentially relevant paper. Here is the second level. Me and Despina, we screen all the 100 papers together, and we decide to include 40% of these papers. Also, you may note the lateral search. This is what Marie-Claude was saying. You can add papers that you found, for example, by just exporting the literature, and this is called lateral search because it will not pre-specified by the in your protocol. And also you can take all the paper that has been cited in this 101 paper and see the reference list and look for if you are, for example, missing some articles. We did that, and doing that we retrieved 7 other papers that were relevant for our review. So it's a good number. 7 out of 40 is a good number.
Does the lateral search, I guess, affect like the quality if you're adding any papers afterwards? Does it take away from what you've done
No.
previously? No?
No, actually, you can also specify on your protocol that you are going to do lateral search. It's suggested, is recommended, yes, to do that. And as you can see, our agreement was almost perfect. So good job. Any question about screening? So everybody is thinking that this is a fun activity. I would say it's a boring activity. It must be done systematically, otherwise it loses its power. So data extraction. This is also a very fun activity. It consists on extract all information that you need from this paper. So you have screened all your paper, you selected all your 40 papers that are interesting. Now what to do? You have to start describing those papers and pick information that are useful. You can select some formal characteristic of the studies that is good to describe. For example, who's the author, in which year the paper was it published. Some characteristic of the design of the study is very useful. For example, which design was used in the studies, what is a cohort study, a case control studies, a randomized control trial, what's the sample size. If you have longitudinal data, you can describe how long the patients or the participant has been followed up in time. They may influence your results, for example. Which is the main exposure, which is the main outcomes. And other characteristics, for example, maybe just thinking whether they conduct a multivariate analysis or just an univariate analysis without adjusting for any variables. Which are those variables that they adjust for? For example, are all the analyses, did all the analyses take into account sex, for example, or gender? Did all the analyses take into account the age? So it's better to describe which paper has done all these steps correctly or not. These have been also independently performed. This is a huge source of error. So the more the work is boring and the more we make mistakes. So this is boring. Activities has to be done independently by two people. So we are sure not to miss information or not to misreport information. So in the paper, we report a summary of those data extraction in the first table, characteristics of included studies. We choose to present the sample, for example, from 1958 British Bird Court, and so the author and the year, and the design they used, whether they were cohort studies or register study. Put the level of analysis just for this paper because there were differences on the level of analysis. Number of participants, year of birth, year follow-up, how long was the follow-up, and which was the outcome that they measured, and which were the exposure factor that they measured. For example, this paper, the first paper, focused only on suicide. Other paper focused only on suicide attempt, other just on suicide ideation, other on both suicide and suicide ideation. This paper measured a lot of risk factors. This one just one. So this is an overview of all your studies. You can also use, for example, to present very graphically the results. You can see, for example, most studies were from UK, Sweden, or Northern Europe. No study from only one study for Asia, for example. Most studies were on suicide, less than suicide attempt. Most studies were used a design, a registered design, other a cohort design, etc. Very intuitively, you can see which are the factors that are the most investigated. For example, birth order were frequently investigated more than, for example, birth length. This is just a way to present information that you can just do your. We did not present these plot in the paper, for example. I used in the conference, for example, when I present the study. There are more data to extract, and they did not show in the paper. For example, here, so we included paper that have been published on the same cohort in different years. We have difference between papers. We cannot include, for example, 2 papers on the same cohort in the same year, because otherwise in the meta-analysis we would have included twice the same participants, right? So when, for example, there were 3 studies here, 1, 2, 3, published in the same cohort, the Northern Finland bird cohort, well, you have to decide which one you want to include, the 2 that you want to exclude. To take a decision, we choose, for example, some criteria. We prefer to include the studies that focus on both sex or both gender, that have the longest follow-up, that has the largest sample size, and we're just looking at the characteristics of these studies. You can, for example, if there were one that focused just on males and not on females, they were not the preferred studies among the 3 studies. So this is information just for you to decide. You need to extract those information, because otherwise it's just a subjective feeling. It can take a long time. It can be very, very long. For example, in case we are a lot of studies from Sweden, so I had to figure out which, for example, the follow-up of each papers, which is the longest one, and so do this graph to make sure that my risk factors were not overlapping, my patients were not overlapping when I finally choose the paper to include. And I built kind of algorithm to decide which paper, which option I should choose for each risk factors. These are not information that you publish, for example, but it's useful for you and is necessary for you to make the right decisions. And last but not least, you have to also extract quantitative information, if you want to perform a meta-analysis. So the main association of interest can be expressed in different way: mean, standard deviation, percentage, effect size, odds ratio. You can extract those information. And also you want to extract all the information on the sex, age of the participants, because we will see we're going to use those information later. So I just say that information about the association of interest, for example, association between teenage motherhood and risk of suicide later, can be reported in different way. You can measure age, for example, as a continuous variables, like the years, or as a categorical variables, like teenage versus not teenage mother. And the way in which these information are presented depends on the measurement scales of the variables. If you have, for example, the association between 2 continuous variables can be like age and BMI, can be reported as a correlation coefficient or a regression coefficient, standardized, non-standardized. There are a lot of ways it can be reported. Association between a continuous and a categorical variable, for example, between BMI and sex, can be reported as an effect size, standardized mean differences, the Cohen's d, that I think you know. It can be a t-test, you can have the results of the t-test, of the f-test. It depends on the choice of there are multiple choices to do those analyses, so each one pick the one they prefer and they report different tests, different information. Association between 2 categorical variables can be expressed as odds ratio, risk ratio, hazard ratio, all sorts of ratios. So there are very different ways to report those information. And as you can imagine, you cannot pull together all those effect size in the way they are presented. You have to, you might have to convert one effect size into one another. When you do your overall estimates, your overall effect size, your overall summary estimates, you want to choose which measure you want to use. For example, let's say that I want to report my summary effect size as a Cohen's d. I have to take all the studies. There are 3 studies here. For example, one is measured as the measure are reported as an odds ratio. I have to convert this odds ratio in a Cohen's d. So every study is measured, use the same association, right? Once I have the same association, I can do my quantitative meta-analysis. So there are a lot of formulas that enables you to convert those effect size. For example, you have odds ratio, you use those formula, you can derive the d and the variance. This is easy. Sometimes you need multiple steps before arriving to the right conversion. This is an example. Here we have odds ratio in one study, coins D in another studies, and risk ratio in another study. But we see the odds ratio can be transformed easily into a coins D. Risk ratio maybe is a little bit more complicated, so we have to think about what's an odds ratio, what's a risk ratio are. And you can see these are 2x2 tables. This is the basic of statistics. You understand the tables, you understand everything. Here, for example, let's say that we are studying a association between gender, sex, or ADHD. So you have the number of males with ADHD, the number of males without ADHD, and the same for the females. And you know, for example, that the risk ratio, the one the study used here, just, the 30 here, the number of males with ADHD divided by the totals of males, here, divided by the number of females with ADHD divided by the total of females. So this is the risk ratio that is reported in the studies. But to calculate an odds ratio is just you use the same tables, just the mathematical difference. You do the number of males with ADHD divided by the number of males without ADHD, divided by the number of female with ADHD, divided by the number of female without ADHD. So use the same number. So you may want to find in the paper those four numbers, so those four frequencies. So rebuild your table, so you can calculate an odds ratio, right? And once you calculate the odds ratio, now we know we applied the formulas we see before, and we can convert the odds ratio in the coins D. And now all the three studies are in the same metric. So just an example to see that sometimes you may want to discard the paper because there is not the same effects, the same association, but we may want to think about whether it's possible to convert between these effect sides. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you need a little some passage, but then you can convert all those effect sides. I put you the web address for the document. It's a PDF. When you find a lot of very useful formulas to convert between among effect size. For example, you have a coins D, you want to convert in a correlation coefficient, etc. Just click here to access the document. There are a lot of these formulas. Another information that you want to extract is the information about how the exposure is measured, is categorized, for example. And this is important because not all studies measure the same thing in the same way. Like maternal age can be measured in continuous way or in categorical ways. And when you want to do a meta-analysis, you may want to make sure that the information you are merging makes sense, because meta-analysis is good, you have a good final estimates, but if the initial data you merge are not good, it's like garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that everything is measured in the same way, that everything is defined in the same way. We publish all our decision about that in the appendix of the paper. And for example, we documented how each study defined categorize the exposure here on the age of father's age. And from these categories, we recategorize into these three categories that are the same for across all the four studies. And so we are making sure that once you pull all the results together, we are putting categories. When you say young paternal age, we are talking about the same things for all the studies. Right, makes sense? And this is a screenshot of the Excel, part of the Excel files that finally you need to perform meta-analysis. You can, all those part is just information you may or may want to add, but the part that you really need for your calculations are those 4 columns. for example, in my case. In other case, can be just two columns, that the quantity and the variance. But basically, this is it, that information. So I can just rebuild the 2x2 tables. The number of treatment, number of each case corresponds to one column here. And this is because I decided in advance to use, for example, an odds ratio as my main measure of effect. I would have need different information if I have used another metric, for example, a standardized mean differences, right? So just think in advance in which unit your main effect will be expressed, and then you extract the information you need. So this is an example of a report this in the paper. The three investigators independently extracted the following information from the article selected. For example, we listed first author, years of publication, and everything. This information can vary from one study to another, of course. We choose those information because they make sense in our cases, but may not make sense in other papers. Just choose the one that is important for your paper. We also stated that if information was unavailable or unclear from the paper, the corresponding author was contacted to obtain relevant data. This is another thing you may want to do. You just write an email to the author, and with a little bit of good luck, you obtain the answer. Yeah, we have been lucky. Half of the case, the answer, yes. And now I have a new friend in Illinois. It's true, we organized a symposium together. So, do you have any question about this process?
When you registered your protocol at the beginning, do you have to register the data extraction plan, or is that developed afterward?
No, you can just say you're gonna extract data. Okay. No, it was not pre-specified. I mean, you can specify a lot of things in the protocol, but it's not mandatory. Okay.
So when you are showing the formula sheet, do you do them like hands? Do you do them by hand, or like is there any?
Well, not with pencil and paper, but you can use software R, for example, but you can do by hand, of course. There are websites that helps you to do this automatically. I didn't put the website, but if you Google it, for example, converting between effect size, you will also have a website that lets you, for example, put this information and translate it into effect size. Yes, but there are easy formulas, so you can do by hand easily. Okay, well, next step is the quality assessment. That's another important part of the process. So what is quality assessment? Quality assessment. So they also know as risk of bias assessment. Is a judgment, is an assessment of the methodological quality of the paper. So it is referred to internal validity of the papers, where they use all the methodological precautions, all the methodological standards to do a good paper, to have a good methodology. So you judge this methodology, and of course, if there is a low risk of bias, this is a good quality of the paper. You are more confident that the results, you can trust the results, right? If the high risk of bias, you are a little bit more doubtful about the association they present. And this is going to take into account this information when you present your systematic review. You can say two studies found this association, yes, but one was of bad quality, so maybe the first is most trustworthy. So different elements that determine the quality of a study, right? Can be the sample size, can be how well they follow up the patients, can be whether the investigator was blind to a treatment or something. So being blind for the treatment, the intervention can make sense in randomized control trial, does not make sense in observational studies. So different criteria to judge the quality, and different tools that helps you to evaluate the criteria that define a good or a bad study. And also this is an independent process. Again, two people should go across the studies and evaluate independently the quality, and then we will see if there is an agreement or not on the paper. There are some available scales for doing that. One is the grade, grading of recommendation, assessment, development, and evaluation. As you can see, the assessment is just green is okay, pink is not okay, and yellow is doubtful. So it's not just a strict assessment it's not a score. Okay. This is useful for randomized control trials. For example, they have items, you judge on the random sequential generation, whether it's good or not. They make no sense for all the studies. But I see that in other papers, they adapted the same system, just changing the items. But you can find scales that are specific to your design. For example, we use an observational study, and we relied on the Newcastle-Ottawa scale that is largely used. And there are different items that help you to evaluate the quality of an observational cohort studies. For example, we evaluate three components: the selection of the participants, the comparability between the exposed and unexposed, and outcomes. And you can read, for example, first criteria is representativeness of the exposed cohort. So is the cohort truly representative of the community? So this is just your judgment. You may want to read the paper. Is the paper use data from a representative cohort from Sweden? You may give a point because the cohort is representative. If there is no description of the division of the cohorts, or like, for example, this cohort is use a participant from that I randomly selected in the street last year. Maybe it's not trustworthy. It's not random. It's not representative. So you cannot give a point of this study because of this. And well, it's not useful to go into all these criteria because it depends on one study to another. So each of these scales have different criteria, and you can attribute points for each having met or not a criteria. It's just to use this information in a qualitative way. For example, to assess how confident you are in the results of the paper that you are included, and of course, never use this information just in an isolated way. You have to ponderate and also use this information together with indices like, for example, heterogeneity, on evidence for publication bias. We're going to see that later. And also you may want to, if you're doing a quantitative analysis, for example, homemade analysis, you may want to exclude paper that have a poor quality to see if the results are changed, if the results are heavily influenced by the poor quality of some paper. Also, there is a suggestion to tend to attribute score and just to evaluate how good is a paper. Of course, it's not. We may have different opinions on that, but this is just a qualitative information that you may want to take into account. Also, report this information on the paper. For example, in the method section, we wrote the following: study quality was assessed using the Newcastle-Ottawa Quality Assessment Scale, and this scale assesses three criteria. We described briefly those criteria. For example, participant selection that include the representativeness of the cohorts, comparability that include, etc. We described the fact that two investigators have performed those quality assessment, and a third have been involved in the process when there were discrepancies between the two. And you can report a nice table with, for example, all the overall all the evaluation and for all the paper and your agreement between the observation, and each one can have their own conclusion and they judge your quality assessment. Okay. But this is a really important part to do. We were very lucky because our studies, because of the design, because of our study, was very high quality. But in another paper, in another systematic review, we didn't do any meta-analysis, but the paper were very low quality, and so when we describe the results, we had to be very, very careful when we say, for example, this is an association among 4 studies among 5 studies. Yes, but what's the quality of those studies? Right, you have to weight that information. Obviously, so far, do you have any questions? The best thing to have question is just to try to do that in your systematic review. You're gonna have a lot of questions, but all those information also are useful to do the narrative review, the narrative part of your review. So right, if you take those images, you just passing from the study you collected to an intelligible and a summary of the information across the studies. So just is a synthesis that is more than just the sum of the single parts. Something more is an overall evaluation, is something that take into account quality, take into account years of publication, take into account a lot of information. It's not just all the study together. So you summarize, you critically appraise the studies, and you synthesize all the parts. Not just some writing. There are some standards, for example, if you want to check standards for reporting a narrative review, as pretty straightforward. Just describe what you see and weight according to the quality of quality of the studies, etc. You can use narrative review even if you do a meta-analysis. There are not two excluding steps. You have to do your narrative review and then complement it with the quantitative analysis. An example, for example, here we wrote most studies adjusting for confounding factor in multivariate analysis. Reported those most of these factors report those response association between increasing birth order and suicide, with adjusted association being 20%, 10-20% stronger than the crude association. All those is just a qualitative element that you can use. For example, there were also evidence of an association in 2 within family studies, comparing siblings from the same family. So we are reporting narrative disinformation because we know the sibling studies are a stronger design, because they compare people from the same family. So we qualitatively know that those results are more trustworthy, more strong than the other one. And important to qualitatively say, to narratively say all that. So basically we did this in all the paper, and we just complemented it with a quantitative analysis when we performed that. That brings us to the 7th step, the meta-analysis or the quantitative analysis per se. What does it look like? Well, graphically, this is the results of your analysis. So this is a forest plot, and does someone want to describe what you can read, what you can observe by this forest plot? What kind of information can you assess from this plot?
Strength of the association for each of the studies that are listed there.
Mm-hmm. So you can see that by
with the OR, right?
The OR, yeah.
Yeah, there.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's start. What we observe. We have the list of studies included, right? We have some information like the cases among young mothers. This is, for example, an analysis between if there is an association between teenage motherhood and risk of suicide in the offspring. So we report this information, then the number of studies, the first author, the year, etc. The number of cases among young mother, the number of cases among older mother. And then, as you said, Espinal, we see an odds ratio. This is the strength of the association between being born from a young mother with respect to a older mother for our suicide risk later in life. this is numerically reported here, but also graphically reported here, right? So this is the odds ratio scale. This the central point of this of each of these figure is the effect estimate for each study, which means that the odds ratio, the association, for example, in these studies, people born from young mother were twice as likely to die by suicide than people born from older mother, right? And so here, the central point of this trait is about 2 here, right? 2. And this is the confidence intervals. The confidence intervals, just very briefly, is a measure of the precision of the studies. It tells you that if you repeat the studies with the same sample, for 100 times, 95% of the time, you have a result that can be from here to here, but not more extreme and not less extreme, right? Yes.
For the column of the weight, is that saying that each of the studies that is there, is it accounting for a certain amount? I don't know if the word is variance to use, but that it's like for my pooled OR, like that first study is accounting for like 4.72% of the total. Is that what it's saying?
Yes, basically is how much each study contributed to this is the overall estimates. Okay. Yes, exactly. So this is the overall estimates. This is the summary of all this information across all these studies. So you may notice, for example, that the more participants I have in the studies, the shorter is the confidence intervals, right? For example, here there are some 20,000 people, and here there are about less than 2,000 people. Look at the confidence interval; it's very narrow here. It's very large here. Okay. And also the central point, the estimate for the studies is larger here when the study has a lot of people, and it's smaller when the study has less people, and also have larger confidence intervals. So there is a relationship between the sample size and the precision of your estimate. And basically, if you have a larger sample size, you have more statistical power. If you have more statistical power, your estimation is more precise, right? You can see here. And the more precise is your estimation, the more your studies count when we estimate the overall effect size, right? This study is not very precise because they have not enough power to be precise, right? So it counts like 4% for the estimation of the pooled estimate of the overall effect size. And these studies account from 23% of the studies because it's large samples, it's very precise, it's very trustworthy, The overall effect size is the same principle, just represented differently, but the width of this figure is represented the confidence intervals, right? And as you can see, the confidence intervals are very narrow for the pooled estimate. And this is why we do a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis enables to put together different studies that may reach different conclusions, and we have a lot of statistical power so a lot of precision. And when you estimate our confidence intervals, this estimation is very precise. Confidence intervals, is for the odds ratio, for example, odds ratio of 1 means that there is no significant difference between two groups, because if these were 1, would be having a teenage mother. Multiply your chances to die by suicide by 1, It is not multiply your chances, right? So if the confidence intervals overlap 1, your effect is not significant. Let's take these studies. In these studies, the confidence intervals overlap 1. This is the line for 1, right? So the study is not statistically significant. The association is not statistically significant in these studies, right? Although, if you look at the point estimate, this number, 1.8, is even bigger than these studies. Although these studies have the power to conclude for a significant difference, right? But the point estimate is the same. It means that in the two studies, the risk of suicide of people born from young mother is the same. But the statistical power to conclude this is different. So this is the strength of meta-analysis. You can put together all those studies, you have a big sample size, and you can make conclusions that you cannot do with studies having low power. Yes?
I'm sorry, it's kind of like a detailed question, but what's, like, let's say, like a pooled estimate, is it similar to like an average?
Is a weighted average. I mean, is a mean, let's say, is like a mean, you weight this mean by the inverse of the weights. So, you weight inverse of the variance, sorry. So yes, the weights applied to the mean estimates. And calculation may be different depending on what model you use. But anyways, I was just to become familiar with all those concepts: effect size, p-values, confidence intervals, and it's really helpful to become familiar to those concepts. And basically, there are two kind of models that you can use to estimate this pooled effect: fixed effect models and random effect models. So fixed effect models, the assumption is that there is one true effect size for all the studies. And the reason why we have difference in the results of these studies is because of estimation error, sampling error, for example. For example, let's say that here is a forest plot. I just report without confidence intervals here. This is the association we observe, and we assume that actually there is a. So this is the association we observe, and this here is the overall pooled association, and we assume that there is all the studies have a true underlying strength of association, but we observe a different value because of those errors. These are just the sampling error of the study, right? So there's a distribution that are centered around the main global effects. And I want to ask: how plausible is this assumption? So let's think about three cases. No, we want to study the association between poverty and mental health. First case, we have 3 studies from Montreal, for example, published between 2014 and 2016. We may assume that those studies measure the same things, and the difference are just because of errors, because Montreal between 2014 and 2016, maybe the policy is not changed as much. But this is different. For example, if you consider 3 studies, always from Montreal, but the span from 1994 to 2016, we can assume that the policy for poverty and the association between poverty and mental health might have changed in those years, right? This is even more evident if we want to pull studies that are from 3 different countries. How can we assume that the relationships between poverty and mental health is the same in Canada or in Sweden? So this assumption is, in 99% of the case, non-tenable. That's why they developed random effects model. Random effects model assume that the true association is different from one study to another, right? The difference in the true association between studies depends, for example, in the characteristic of the samples. The one is from Sweden and one is from Canada. The one is from older people and one is for younger people. Those differences change the true underlying estimates. And to represent is here. Here is the observed estimates. This is the true estimates, but the true estimates are different from one study to another, right? And the consequence is that As before, we have just one source of variance, the between studies variance. Here we take into account two sources of variance. As before, the between study variance, so the difference between the observed estimate to the pooled estimates, but also the within studies variance. And without going into further details, this is the model you have to choose. And if you want to choose the other model, you have to motivate why. Basically, fixed effect model, you choose this model if you believe that all three studies included in the analysis of your studies are functionally identical in all point of view. This assumption is not tenable. You choose a random effect model. You choose a fixed effect model. Well, the goal is to compute the common effect size for the identified population, and you don't want to generalize outside your given population. So you want to do a generalization just for population for Montreal, for example. But if you want to say my effect is the same in all country, you cannot. You have to use the random effect model. Sometimes people say that high heterogeneity between studies motivate a random effect model, but actually this is not the case. This is an a priori assumption. You think about whether you can assume the random effect model or not and choose. Yes.
With a fixed effects model, so then let's say you're looking at cohorts and you have 5 studies that use the same cohort. Would you opt to use a fixed effects model for that?
For the same cohort?
Yeah. Different years though, but let's say the same cohort. It's a longitudinal thing, right? Yeah. And let's say it all came from the 1958 British cohort. Would you want to use the fixed effects models in that case?
But I don't see any case when you want to pull together.
I don't know, let's say, it's a good question.
Because for example, maternal age is the same, whatever you measure.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So there are, by definition, use different studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But for example, in Sweden, they use a register. They take, for example, register of all people born in 1996. Can you pull with people with the register of people born in 1997? Probably yes, but not with people born in 2006. Probably. It's just a decision you have to make. Very rapidly, there are different ways to estimate those models. In the paper, we use Dersimonian and Laird estimates. Globally, there are very similar estimates, although there are some difference, but this is not. Also, how many studies are necessary to perform meta-analysis? This is a good question. Can you perform with 2 studies? Well, yes, you can. But in this case, the random effect model and the fixed effect model are the same because you don't have enough information to estimate those components of variance. You may also want to estimate heterogeneity between studies. This is important. With the random effect model, you can estimate the heterogeneity between studies. And you can see here, for example, a pooled estimate from those studies those studies are less different between them, so the heterogeneity would be smaller than these studies when the estimates are very different. You can use a test, the Cochrane Q-test, or quantify the percentage of heterogeneity in your estimates. And there is a rule of thumb: if E square is over 65%, this is high heterogeneity. There are a lot of those tests and estimates. You have to judge a little bit which one is good for you. Software, you can use R. There are a lot of packages on R. How to perform meta-analysis is very straightforward. It's a little bit late, so I just go a little bit rapidly. But this is the code. This is 4 lines of code. You estimate everything you need. Your pooled estimate, your heterogeneity, etc. If you don't like R, I don't know why, but you can use. You can with 1 line you can print a force plot with R. With a little bit of effort, you do a pretty force plot. You can also use Revman 5. Is from the Cochrane collaboration. Is free on the internet and is more user friendly. You can put your numbers and have all the estimates. Comprehensive meta-analysis is also very good. Is user friendly, but you have to pay.
How much approximately for the last one?
Comprehensive meta-analysis can be between 500 and 1,000. And if you want to add some add-ons, like for example, the tool for estimate meta-regression and other things, you can add other 500 maybe.
Is it a one-time purchase or is it like a subscription or yearly subscription?
Good question. I don't know. I think there is 1 year for the. Actually, I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Is it the software used by Stefan?
Yes, it is.
The comprehensive meta.
The comprehensive meta-analysis. And it is very good software. The calculations are not very difficult. You can do by hand for the fixed effect model. The other one is too complicated, but so every software should give the same results.
And I see the software will draw the forest plot for you.
Sorry?
The software, we will be able to derive the forest plot from the software.
Yes, with those. Yes, with
Yeah.
those.
In either of them?
All the software gives the first plot. Yes. So I have another couple of slides if you want. I can continue or just we can stop here as you want. I go on?
No one said no, so.
The one say no. Okay. So we are in democracy, the majority wins. Just very rapidly, some other analysis you may want to do. So as in, in classical study, you study an association, then you want to adjust for the confounding variables. The same things you can do in meta-analysis. In particular, when there is a lot of heterogeneity in the studies, you may think, is this heterogeneity because of differences across the studies? For example, different in terms of countries, different in terms of populations, age at follow-up. In our study, we explored, for example, if this heterogeneity, for example, here 70%, could be explained by the age at follow-up. For example, people that follow up until 20 years, 30 years old, or until adulthood. I mean, 30 is adult, but you know what I mean. And you can perform meta-regression, and basically you can evaluate the effect of, for example, the length of follow-up on your estimates, and once you take into account this heterogeneity, how much heterogeneity rest to be explained. You can evaluate. Another method is to perform subgroup analysis. Just split the studies among the one conducted among adult population, the one conducted among youth population, and you can see if the estimates change. It's better to pre-specify all those analyses in the protocol. Another issue is publication bias. As you know, the studies that have a significant effect are published more easily, and there are authors that have studied without any effects, and they don't publish the study, so you're not aware that the study has been never done. This can create bias, in analysis. You can estimate. There is an estimate of whether this bias is plausible or not, and many ways to explore the risk of those bias. For example, you can use a funnel plot. It is the plot that I represent here, and basically, if the points are symmetrical to the line and overall distributed inside the triangle, there is no risk for publication bias. And also you can test, so there is a test to statistically test if there is if the funnel plot is asymmetric or not, etc. And you can also use the methods that tells you how many studies are missing, or potentially. With some statistical analysis, for example, you can see that in this comparison for smoking in pregnancy, probably 2 studies to have a symmetric funnel plot you would need 2 more studies, and maybe the 2 studies never been published. It's not a perfect science, and just a suggestion. So you have to interpret the way it is. Another way to assess how robust are your results, just to estimate the same association, removing one study at a time. For example, this is the association we had when we use all the studies, and then we remove the first studies, and the association is basically the same. The heterogeneity is even higher. Then we put back these and remove the second studies, and the estimate change a little bit. So you can see if there is one study that explains most heterogeneity, or there is one study that influences a lot the results. And if everything looks like this, you are reassured that there is not many bias, or not one study that influences the result the most. You can do pretty figures if you want, but yeah, it's the same. And final, you have to report your results, and only thing I want to say is there are guidelines to report those results to make sure that all the items you need are there. Prisma, if you report, for example, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. If you are working with observational studies, the MOOS guidelines are used. And if you want to see all the guidelines for all the studies, by the way, you can look at this website, Equator. You can download all the papers and the guidelines you need for reporting your studies. I put some links to useful resources like free handbooks, tutorials like Library Advanced, Cochrane Collaboration. Cochrane Library is a database of all meta-analysis from Cochrane. A good introduction, a MOOC, Massimiliano open course if you want to follow them. And that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
We'll all do a meta-analysis on your PhD.
So let me just move a general appreciation. So having probably done a systematic review and a meta-analysis, knowing people are just more scared of meta-analyses, but how would you really qualify? Because really you're essentially doing a systematic review, and then you're just kind of adding more of a deeper analysis, right? So maybe to kind of demystify the whole meta-analysis thing, maybe a more general comment.
I'm very happy with these questions, and I hope it was clear that most of the work is the systematic review. Meta-analysis, it takes you 1 hour. 2 hours if you want to use R. But it's a good investment in time. But yes, the analyses are really simple. But the analyses are really not useful if you didn't do a systematic process before. You can pull all results together, but if you don't know the quality of the studies you are using, the characteristic of the studies basically is garbage. Other questions? Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving us your time, Massimiliano, and to Dr. Jeffrey as well for helping us organize. And I hope that the film went very well too. Thank you.
Thank you.